In this video, we're going to show you the most difficult thing to do, which is replacing the lower tape plate that's rusted out on an old 333 tape machine, Better Pack 333 tape machine. As you can see, the front of this plate is missing. It rusted and fell off. The replacement plate, luckily, is made of stainless steel and will never rust. So once you do this, you're good for life. So let's talk about what we have to do to replace the lower tape plate. We are going to have to spread the frames apart to get the old plate out and install the new plate. So let's start by removing the water bottle. This is an old style whiskey water type water bottle. And we'll remove the water tank. The next thing we have to remove is the key drum cover. There's 3 screws and they're 1024 screws, so they're unique to the key drum cover. So don't mix them up with the rest of the screws, which are going to be 10/32 or 1/4 20. So these 1024 screws are only for the key drum. We've already removed all 3 of them. Now we're going to pop the key drum off and remove the upper tape plate here. Next thing we're going to have to remove is the upper feed wheel, the shears, the plate weight assembly. All this has to come off the machine. Okay? Good. Now we're going to remove, next we'll remove the upper feed wheel shaft. And there is a small C-clip that holds the upper feed wheel shaft in the machine. You want to snap that off. And let me see if I can get it real quick here. I'm trying to work at an angle so you can see. So we've got that off, and that's your C-clip. We'll throw everything in a little yellow container right here. We have to loosen the 2 3/32 screws that hold the metal feed wheel onto the upper feed wheel shaft here. So we're going to loosen those next. And hopefully we can just tap the shaft out. So we'll use a screwdriver here and just try to tap the shaft out. And we take the upper feed wheel off and carefully remove, because there's going to be spacer washers here. You have a large spacer washer, a small spacer washer, and another small spacer washer. We'll throw those into our little parts bin. And the next thing we have to remove are the 2, what they're called, pivot rods. Here's one, and here's the other pivot rod. Now, the old style pivot rods are held in by these little retainer clips, and you'll need a hammer and a punch to get those pivot rods out. Okay? So we've already tapped the retainer ring off on this side of the pivot rod for the plate weight assembly, and you'll notice there's 2 shear rollers, shear guide rollers. One is here, one is here. So when you remove this pin, now it won't come out. Hold on one second. I gotta push it through a little. Again, you're talking about a lot of old rust. You want to make sure you don't lose these little shear guide rollers when you take the upper plate weight off. Now, you can see I'm having difficulty, but that's typical on an old machine. So we're just going to plate weight assembly off, and we'll struggle with this for just a second, okay? Go. Okay, so we've taken out the pivot rod and the 2 shear guide rollers. Now I'm going to show you, we're going to take the other pivot rod out. And to do that, again, you take your hammer and a punch. Your retaining ring will be there. Take it off, your punch, and take the other pivot rod out of the machine. Now we're going to set the machine up on its back side, and we want to remove the lower front cover and the tank support shelf. There'll be a screw, this screw right here, which we're going to remove. And again, it's always a little difficult when you have rust We want to pull that out. We also want to disconnect the handle return spring and the crank tensioner spring. We remove the lower front cover. Now we have to remove the tank support shelf. And again, you may find rust in this area right here where you cannot just simply unscrew the screws, in which case I recommend a hammer and a chisel. Just put the hammer and chisel and break the nuts off. So you'll have to do that, okay? We've already removed the 4 screws that hold in the tank support shelf, so we can remove that. We want to remove both the crank tensioner spring and the handle return spring. And the handle return spring is hooked in to the main crank assembly right there, and we'll show you how to reinstall that later. We want to remove the pulley shaft and the 2 pulleys right here. Take those off. And now we're ready to remove the upper and lower shear. And boy, this shear has seen better days. To get the upper shear out, again, you're going to need your nail punch and your hammer. There is a retaining ring on this side of the upper shear, and we're going to tap it through. It'll take just a second here to tap it through. So we've tapped it through. The retaining ring has gotten stuck here on my nail punch. I'm going to pull that off and throw it aside. Then I want to pull this bar, this upper shear bar out. And before I do, I'm going to put my hand here because there's a little spacer washer I don't want to lose. And that's the little spacer washer on the upper shear. Now the upper shear is out of the machine, and we want to take the lower shear out, and that's very simple. There's only 2 springs, one on each side of the frame that's hooked to a pin. You pop that spring, and then you can pull the lower shear up and out of your machine. And notice while we have it out, these are the 2 angled metal rods that hold the lower shear in the machine. So when you put the lower shear back in, make sure you go through these angled metal pieces that cradle the shear. We'll talk about that later when we reinstall everything, okay? Go. Okay, now, so we've cleared out the area inside the tape machine, and there's 2 other screws that take out the lower tape plate that are always going to be rusted, and you're always going to have to chisel them off. There's one on this side right here, a screw, 10/32, and there'll be the same screw on this side, and they are inevitably going to be rusted into the machine, so you're going to have to take your hammer and chisel and knock them out, okay? We've knocked the chiseled off the screws that hold in what's left of this lower tape plate, and you can see them. It's kind of rusty, so we bend them in. Now, we still can't spread the frames apart to get this plate out. To do that, we're going to have to remove at least 2 of the screws, and I always remove all 4 of these 1/4 20 screws on the separator guide plate. I have to remove these, and I'm going to remove, in this case, all 4 because we want to remove the separator guide and clean it. Okay? So we've already removed the 4 screws, 2 on each side, from this separator guide, and that will allow us to remove the front cover here. And on this one, it just pries out. Now we're going to remove, you don't have to remove the rear cover, but we remove the separator guide so that we can clean it. There's only 1 other screw that's keeping us, 2 other screws from keeping us from separating the frames, and that's going to be right here by your main gear. There's 2 screws. One here and one here. So we want to remove these 2 screws, and that will finally allow us to spread the frame apart. So I'm going to go ahead and do this, okay? Now we've removed the 2 nuts right here from the main gear area. And the last thing we actually have to do before we spread the machine apart is we want to remove the lower feed wheel shaft and feed wheel. And there's going to be a reason for that, and we'll explain when you go to reinstall the new tape plate. So we want to remove that. The way to do it is rather simple. You just have to rotate the main gear here and get to the top nut right there, and then it unscrews from right There, it fell into the machine a little because the machine is spread apart a little bit. But you would unscrew it from here and grab that nut, okay? So we remove this nylon insert nut that holds the lower feed wheel shaft into the machine. We can now spread the machine apart just a little bit, just enough to get the old rusted plate out of the machine. And we also want to remove the lower feed wheel shaft. Before we reinstall it, we want to clean it. And you notice this one's a little stiff. It's not spinning like it should. So we want to clean it and oil the ball bearings inside the shaft before we reinstall it. That will be in our next video on installing the new stainless steel lower tape plate. Thanks for watching, and look for the next video when we reinstall a new stainless steel lower tape plate.